You're listening to Bottomshelf Bitcoin. This is episode 60.
Relax. Enjoy your coffee. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Take a chill pill. What is it? Okay.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bottomshelf Bitcoin, the podcast that puts Bitcoin knowledge within everyone's reach. As always, I'm your host, Josh Humphrey, and with me today is Matt Odell, co-host of Rabbit Hole Recap and, I don't know, a bunch of other crap. You've been on the show before. People can go back and listen. I don't know. So
I love it.
Anyways, Matt, welcome.
Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually went back and listened to our last episode, and it was almost a year ago. It was like a day off.
That one was special because it was in person too.
Yeah, it was in person. I will not be going to the effort of beeping everything out at the end on this one. So if just be forewarned. If you're worried about your kids being in the room, maybe just don't. I don't know.
I still feel bad about that episode because you told me ahead of time too.
Nah, it's fine. I think it was funny, but.
Well, anyway,
whatever.
To the listeners, I apologize ahead of time for the amount of cursing that will probably happen. Last time I made a false promise to Josh that I wouldn't curse in the episode, and I think I must have dropped the F-bomb like 30 times. He bleeped it out like 17 times, and then a bunch got through anyway. Yeah.
I was editing it late, and a bunch got through, so it was just kind of like, now I'm like, whatever. It's fine, whatever. All right, so last time we talked about, it's just kind of funny that I went back and listened to what we talked about. And last time we were talking about having an adversarial mindset. We talked about Final Message, which you had kind of just launched. We talked about kind of more privacy on a Bitcoin specific side and what we can do. And so, which is really great because kind of what I wanted to talk to you today about is things that we can do to protect our privacy, not specifically with Bitcoin, right? Like we can do coin joins, we can, protect your private keys. We hopefully all know those things at this point. If not, go back and listen to that episode. I feel like though, in comparison to where we were at a year ago, Whirlpool's come a long way. Some of the coin join stuff has come a long way.
Yeah, massive improvement on that front.
Yeah, for sure. But one of the things that you've kind of, I don't know how to say been pushing for, but you put out some good tutorials and you've been talking about a lot is better phone privacy, especially in light of, these contact tracing apps that they're pushing out and stuff like that. So, why does that matter? Why does, like, I guess what kind of surveillance is out there that we know of at least? And what do we need to do to kind of route around those things?
Well, it's all interconnected, right? We live digital lives, and all of these different aspects are completely interconnected. And if you don't pay attention to all of it, you're going to have gaping holes in whatever your goal is, whatever your threat model that you're trying to work with is. Like little things, like surveillance cameras and facial recognition, location tracking, as we were talking about. But even more specifically, to bring it back to Bitcoin, if you can take all the best practices in the world in terms of using Bitcoin privately, which is not very easy to do. It's very difficult to use Bitcoin privately in a vacuum. But then let's say you paste an address into a plain text message, or Facebook Messenger or Twitter DMs. These things aren't encrypted. All of a sudden you've exposed that address and connected it to whatever your identity is, in whatever situation that is. So it is all very connected. I've been fascinated by this stuff pretty much since the Snowden leaks. So when did Snowden come out? Was that like 2011?
Yeah, something like that.
It was before I found Bitcoin.
Okay, yeah.
And basically what Snowden discovered, we all most of us already had. So the first step is you just have to know, like, if you have a sophisticated actor trying to compromise you digitally, they are going to be able to own your phone. They are going to be able to own your computer. They are going to be able to own whatever electronic device you have. If it's electronic, if it's connected to the internet, especially, they're going to be able to own that device. And people have operated under that assumption for years already. When I talk about sophisticated actors, I'm talking about the U.S. government, the Chinese government, maybe the Russians, a bunch of different, heavily backed corporations that have a lot of resources, a lot of money. They'll be able to own you if it's a direct attack. But what Snowden revealed was that the U.S. government was doing mass surveillance, where it was like dragnet surveillance, where they were able to gather up all this information, and then they store it in these data centers in Nevada and other places to comb through it at a later date. Like, so they can basically, like, every text message you send is being stored on a hard drive somewhere, and it's being connected back to your identity, because it's very hard to get a phone number without connecting it to your identity. So most people have these phone numbers that are not only connected to them, but they're connected to them for life pretty much, because no one changes their phone numbers. And they have logs and logs and logs of all these plain text messages. And at a later date, if you become an actor that they want to pay attention to, or if they're looking for specific keywords, they're able to search through all of that database, just like you would do like a Google search or something. So there's two elements here. There's an element of trying to protect yourself with the understanding that you're never going to be perfect. But there's another element where you just really want to make it difficult and more expensive for these actors to be able to pull off mass surveillance, this cheap dragnet surveillance, where they basically get everyone in one big net, and then they can go back afterwards and search through things.
This is the thing that I don't understand, is why politicians keep voting for this stuff. You would think that they would get, and maybe I just overestimate the intelligence of politicians, you would think that they would understand that this is going to make it difficult for them in the future, right? Like, I mean, this is everything we've seen with Trump, right? Like, regardless of your feelings on him, they're looking for anything. His opponents in politics and media are looking for anything they can to drag up on him, right? And so you would think that politicians would realize this is going to become the future. Anybody with influence and access to these files is going to be able to go back and look through anything that you've emailed or text or whatever. So I just don't get why they keep voting for this crap.
I think for a lot of politicians, they operate under the assumption that this surveillance is happening on everyone else but not themselves. If you told them they were getting surveilled, I think they would be outraged about it. And we see that with Trump right now. Trump recently, I think yesterday, pushed for the FISA bill, the surveillance bill, to get blocked. And I think it did get blocked by Congress, but Trump said that he was going to block it if they didn't block it. And why? The reason was because he just discovered that he's been spied on, and he was angry about it. But if it was just everyone but Trump got spied on, he'd be completely fine with it. He didn't care. It's hypocritical is what it is. And then on top of that, these politicians, the way their incentives are set up is it's all short-term incentives. There's no incentive to build policy that will benefit the country or the world or their citizens in 10 years, 20 years, because their term is only 4 years, some of them even less, and they can only do a max of 8 years, right? So there's no long-term incentive at play there.
Right. That was something interesting that my wife and I were talking about this, and she said, and again, I'm not a huge Trump person, but and I hate that it's so stupid that you even have to say that, right? It's like, people can't just make up their own minds on individual things one at a time, But anyways, something interesting is that he is not I feel like most politicians are looking for their, like, while they're in office, they spend so much time looking around for, like, what's their revolving door pathway, right? So, like, what's the thing what's the industry I can jump off into to be the quote unquote Washington, the post government expert at this company, right? Like Ben Loski, right? It's a great example.
Exactly.
So, but he doesn't need that. He's got his own established, wealth or whatever. So it's not like he's looking to find his own revolving door that he can jump back into and be the kind of like, I've been on the Washington inside. I know how it works for this industry. So let me into this industry and be the expert. So I don't know, just something interesting.
It is weird, right? I mean, that's definitely what one of the things that makes him different from other previous politicians is the door almost revolved in the opposite direction. Like first he became rich and then he became president. With a lot of other politicians, you see them want to create a career for themselves. That's how the incentives align. And you brought up Ben Loski. Ben Loski, he created burdensome regulation, pretending that he was protecting the consumer with the bit license. And then he created a consultancy firm that, after he left, that helped companies get through that burdensome regulation by paying him. So it's like the perfect example of a revolving door. He's on the board of Ripple. Like, this guy's pretending like he actually cares about consumers, but meanwhile he's on the board of Ripple. It's the most obvious thing ever. But that's, you just look at broken incentives, and that's what happens. If you have an incentive and it's broken, the results are gonna be broken.
Yeah. And just to, point out again the hypocrisy in the same day that Trump is calling for, vetoing ending this bill and saying that he's going to veto it if it goes through for these FISA courts. He's also wanting talking about doing an executive order for regulating social media.
Yeah, he's pretty much all 95% of our politicians, 99% of our politicians are complete hypocrites. It is what it is. You just have to. I try not to get caught up in it. We have a weekly news show at Tales from the Crypt, Rabbit Hole Recap, and I intentionally try and always avoid politics talk because I just think at the end of the day, there's very little we can do about it. So I try and focus on what we can change, just to bring it back to our beginning conversation. And I think. The hope that the Constitution and like American ideals will stop mass surveillance is a failed hope. That's not going to happen. But what could happen is we can get people to switch to more privacy-focused operating systems on their phones, more privacy-focused devices. Maybe don't carry your phone with you everywhere you go. Don't use a phone if you don't have to. All these little things, wear a mask when you're in public to defeat facial recognition, wear hats, sunglasses, try not to use KYC services. All these different little things we can do as individuals can help push that back. That actually can have an impact. The whole politics bullshit, I don't think we can really change things. I think it's pretty much at this point bought and paid for by, major corporations, the rich elite, and it's just, it doesn't matter what side of the political spectrum you're on. It's just all corrupt all the way down. So it is what it is.
Yeah. No, and that kind of brings back to a point that you and I were kind of talking about in the last time you were on, that, Bitcoin for me was one of those things that gave me hope that instead of just, sitting around griping about the current state of things that you want to tear down, it gives us something we can be productive and build on. So let's talk about, we're not specifically talking about Bitcoin, but what are things productive that we can do to kind of take back and build these walls up? So let's start with phone stuff. Like what can we do for our phones?
So the recent kick I've been on, the first thing you can do is just try not to use them if you don't have to. Specifically these smartphones, They're powerful computers, and they're in your pocket, and they're tracking you all over the place. Depending on what apps you have installed, depending on what you're using on the phone, but also just intimate things like ingrained things like SIM cards. So when you register a phone number, first of all, nowadays it's way harder to register a phone number without your identity attached to it. So it becomes like a de facto identity. We see services use it almost like a social security number.
Right. Which the social security number was never supposed to be like
I know,
this.
it's ridiculous as
private
well.
thing. Like I don't think it's quite this way anymore, but I know when they first started rolling them out, it was like you could use it like a VIN number, and you could decode, you could work backwards. It was based on things like birth year, month, and what was I going to say? Birth year, month, and like area of the country or something like that. And so it was never really supposed to be this secure thing.
Yeah, and then there's like people to this day that treat it as private information. Like we had Equifax got hacked. Every single adult American had their social security number compromised. And if not from that, from somewhere else. Like it should not be treated as a private thing. But anyway, back to cell phones. When you use a cell network, if you have all location services, everything turned off, and you're just using cell, even if it's not a smartphone, they can track, the cell company can track your location based on something called cell phone triangulation. So they have 3 towers that are nearest you, and with some simple math, they can figure out where between those 3 towers your phone is at any given time with no GPS or anything. So at the bare minimum, we're talking about, maybe not fine-grained location, but good enough location tracking on pretty much anyone who uses a phone with the cell data turned on. So how can you mitigate that? You can mitigate that by buying a SIM card. In a lot of places, you still can, but they make it very difficult with cash. You buy it with cash, and you either give no name, or sometimes you give like a fake name and address and stuff, and they don't actually verify it. And it feels shady, because they make it feel as shady as possible. Like you normally can't do this in like a Walmart or a Target or something like that. Usually you have to go to like one of these more rundown types of phone stores. But then even at that point, they still can track that phone number. They just might not know that phone number is yours. So then you're in a situation where you're trying to mitigate that phone number getting connected to your name regardless. So what happens is you end up having to probably rotate it a lot and constantly switch it around, because even if you do everything perfectly, they could probably figure out where you work and where you live. And then from there, they could probably figure out your identity. This whole idea of, we hear this a lot, and anonymized location data. We're just using anonymized location data to see migration patterns and this and that, and just it's all the personal info stripped. It's bullshit. There's no such thing as anonymized location data, because they know where you work and where you live and who you see and all this other fucking shit. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And this is why it's ideal not to carry a phone at all. But that's not practical for most of us.
Right. Oh, I was just going to say, like, they, just going deeper into the anonymized thing, like, if they look at this phone number and they see that it spends, 8 hours a day at this location, and then it goes to location B at night and, spends half their time there, and then a couple of other places, they can pull that address and that workplace and pretty quickly figure out that it's you.
Yeah, it becomes pretty obvious when you start to think about it. Especially when you start mixing it in with, what happens if I meet you for coffee and you are great with your privacy. But for me, I put in, I'm meeting Josh for coffee in my Google Calendar, right? And then both of our locations end up in the same place. Little things like that. Once you start pooling all these, when you look at mass surveillance, you imagine like an Excel spreadsheet, imagine like a database where they're just filling all these different categories with all this different information, and they're able to cross-reference across all the different categories. And each data set they have just gives them even more overall type of view into what the situation is. When you start going down this rabbit hole, you quickly become, overwhelmed, intimidated, a feeling of uselessness. Like there's no powerlessness. Like you're never going to be able to do anything about it. And I think that's why it's important for people to realize, like, operate under the assumption you're going to be owned here if it's a sophisticated actor, but also don't get intimidated because every little thing you do reduces those data sets. It makes it more expensive for the mass surveillance. So then we move to smartphones, and there's basically 95% of smartphones are either Android or Apple, either iPhone or Google. And that's a major issue, right? Because you have these two huge U.S. corporations. And we saw with Snowden, pre-Snowden, one of the ideas was, okay, the government's probably spying on us, like all these different governments are spying on us, but at least the companies are fighting in our best interests. But what we saw with Snowden is that they were often complicit, sometimes voluntarily because they wanted government contracts and whatnot, and sometimes they were forced to with secret government orders, and they weren't allowed to tell us about it. So now we basically have to operate under the assumption that these corporations are extensions of the government. Even when you read an article that says like, oh, Apple didn't unlock the phone and the FBI is upset with Apple, you just have to assume, you have to operate under the assumption that that's just bullshit. It's the only safe way to operate.
Yeah, and on that one specifically, from what I've read, there actually were already known exploits out in the wild for that version of the phone. Talking about the San Bernardino, California shooting.
There's a couple of them, and there was another one that every time there's a shooting involving an iPhone, they try and set precedent in a case. Yeah.
So the reality is there was known exploits out there available that the FBI could have already gotten. They didn't need Apple's help in that, and so once you realize that, there is no more pretense that they were just going to use it just this once. They were looking for, the golden key.
Yeah, exactly. And on top of that, there's, like iCloud backups aren't encrypted. They're not end-to-end encrypted. So Apple can see your iCloud backups. So they hand over that information. They hand over a bunch of other information. And it's mostly theater. And Apple phones they're closed source, so we can't really tell what's running on them anyway to begin with. And just for the listeners, there's no such thing as a safe backdoor. If you give someone a key to the data, then it automatically compromises everything. If someone else gets that key, they're going to have access. If it leaks, if it gets stolen, putting your trust in these companies or putting your trust in these governments to safeguard this data has proven to be a folly in the past plenty of times. So there's no such thing as a safe backdoor. A perfect example is those locks that the TSA makes you use that has like a little master key on the bottom so they can override it. Those master keys ended up on eBay like 6 months later. And people are still using those locks, and it's bullshit, right? Like if you're even like the most little sophisticated of it, you don't even have to be that sophisticated of an actor. You can get one of those keys and you can unlock those devices, unlock those locks. So there's no such thing as a safe backdoor.
I was going to say the last time I flew, I felt all good about, not good about the TSA being able to get into my suitcase, but okay, like, all right, TSA is going to get in, but otherwise it's locked. Well, it doesn't do any good because TSA unlocked it and then left it unlocked.
Exactly. Which is
they didn't bother to relock it for me, so anybody downstream of that could have grabbed it.
And that's a perfect example, right, of what happens if you give responsibility to these organizations to secure that data. So what we really want is end-to-end encryption, which means that the only person that has the key is yourself. If you want, and the thing is like, you hear a lot like, oh, this is protecting criminal organizations, it's protecting this, it's protecting that. But it comes down to it, at the end of the day, if you want to protect honest citizens, if you want to protect refugees, then it has to protect everyone. Because if there's ability for a government to abuse its power, if there's ability for a corporation to abuse its power, they're going to somewhere along the line at some point. And you need, if you don't have protection for all, you have protection for none, basically. So recently what I've been on about is, if you are going to use a phone, there is a hardened version of Android that's privacy focused. That's called Graphene. The lead maintainer of that is Daniel McKay. And it's like a nice trade-off balance. Like, you're better off not using a smartphone, and you're better off not using a phone altogether, in that order. But the third one is use something like Graphene. And the nice thing about Graphene is it runs any Android app. You can download F-Droid, so you have open source apps. You can download something called Aurora Store if you absolutely need one of these binaries that's on one of these apps that's on Google Play Store. It's like an anonymized way of getting into Google Play Store. But just keep in mind, it's not open source. So there's all these different little trade-offs that you're like trying to navigate down based on your threat model. But all these little improvements help, especially if you don't think of it as like a silver bullet. So I really like Graphene. I've been using it as my daily driver. It's pretty easy to install. The other thing is, there's a couple phones that are like privacy phones that are designed for privacy. The two that come to mind is the Purism phone. The Librem is called Purism Librem. And the other one is the Pine phone. And both of them have hardware switches on them. They run Linux. But on the trade-off balance, when you're trying to think about, like, why do I have this phone in the first place? Why am I not walking around with a phone? Why do I need a phone? Why am I using a phone instead of going phoneless? You'd lose a lot of the functionality if you don't have Android. The fact that you can't run these apps easily, that you can't do all these things easily, is a major drawback of these Linux phones. They're not really there yet. And then on top of that, if I don't know how many people are buying those phones, but like my guess is like 500, 1,000 people are buying the Purism phone.
Right.
Those are 500 or 1,000 people that really, really care about privacy. So you're really putting yourself in this really small bucket that's like an ideal target. It becomes an ideal target. With this, you can buy a Pixel phone for cheap, a Google Pixel phone for cheap. The 3A costs a little under $300. It's like $280.
Yeah.
And you buy it with cash at like a Best Buy or a Walmart or something. And nowadays, you can walk in with a mask and gloves and no one's going to fucking bat an eye. And you buy it with cash for relatively cheap. And then you take 15 minutes and you install Graphene on it. And it's just a really nice balance. Like, I feel like it gives... It's a great defensive option to make this mass surveillance more expensive and more difficult to pull off.
Yeah, you do. There are a few things I feel like if you're going to do this well, and like you said, it's all different levels of trade-off, right? You have to decide for yourself what you're willing to do. But I mean, all of it, overarching everything is you have to decide where you're willing to trade privacy for convenience.
Exactly.
So, right, like Pixel 3, Pixel 3a with Graphene it strikes a good balance of it still is capable of running these things. And I think, there's a reason. Well, I mean, I know there is, like, those phones themselves, the hardware in those phones has secure chips and some things like that, which is why it's kind of a limited range of phones that'll run Graphene, or that Graphene's been tested on, let's say.
Yeah, so Graphene officially supports Pixels 2s through 3. But the 3 and the 3A have the secure chip, the 2s don't. So it's better to pay a little bit more money for the Pixel 3A or the Pixel 3. So you have that secure chip. And the reason device support is so limited is because Daniel McKay, the lead maintainer, he needs to be focused on certain devices in order to basically lock them down. When you have these projects that support a huge amount of devices, you have things like Lineage E is another one. They support a very wide-ranging amount of devices, but individual precautions can't be taken because they're not device-specific. And people hear, Google hardware, is that against the purpose? Google is a huge surveillance company. it's designed to remove all the Google services. They might have something in the hardware. They probably don't. The beauty of Pixel devices is Google intentionally keeps them as open as possible for developers to screw around with them, as opposed to something like a Samsung phone. Even though Samsung makes sexier hardware. So it's all these different trade-off balances. But when I look at it and I need to use a smartphone, I need to be able, need is the wrong word, but look, I prefer to have one, right? It helps my life. It is a convenience versus privacy trade-off, which happens every day. And I know firsthand that, I talk about privacy. I talk about how privacy is important. Am I perfect? No, I'm fucking horrible at privacy. The thing is, once you start caring about privacy, you realize how bad you are at keeping your data private. You realize how much you choose convenience over privacy on a day-to-day basis. But you just try and limit it. You're trying to limit that surface, that attack surface, where you're leaking all this data.
Yeah. So let's talk about. Okay, and you have a really good tutorial for graphing on the Pixel, so I'll link that in the show notes so people can go check that out. I used it. I've had mine for a couple of weeks now. For the first week, I didn't even have my SIM in it. I had it, I just carried it side by side to get used to it with my regular phone, and then I switched over, and I've almost gotten to the point where I don't have to keep my old phone with me. There's a couple of apps that I have to check here and there that I don't want on my graphing phone, but I have to check them once in a while. And it's just, it's just on Wi-Fi. But so let's talk about once you've got the graphene operating system on, what are apps that you would consider like secure apps or reasonably secure apps to use?
Well, a general rule of thumb is you should try and install as few apps as possible.
Right.
You have a fully functioning web browser in there. Most apps function, most websites automatically switch to like mobile web app form. So use the browser as much as possible. Like I don't have a Twitter app installed on my phone, right? I just use the browser. So that can you can eliminate a ton of apps that way, and that's just reduces the surface, because you have to realize like all these different apps they're basically potential attack vectors that can happen. Mm-hmm. The second thing is the apps that you do install, try and install open source apps. If you download F-Droid, it only has open source apps on there. Is that perfect? Can an open source app be malicious? Of course. If you can't inspect the code, you can't inspect the code. It is what it is. Hopefully someone else is. They have the ability to. Someone else has the ability to check. That should help you out a little bit. A Tor browser, I think, is a must. Who knows, how much the U.S. government can get into it or whatever, but it's definitely an improvement. It's one of the most private browsers. Daniel, he really, that built-in browser, he did a lot of work on it as well. I personally think everyone should have a VPN on their phone. I like molvad.net is my favorite. So I have that app there. You can use OpenVPN app in combination with it. But what's nice about their app is it has WireGuard, which is a better VPN protocol. So their app's pretty good. Could it be compromised? Yeah, maybe. It's part of the 25 eyes. These are all the things like privacy versus convenience. You got to be careful about. Samurai Wallet. I love Samurai Wallet. Zeus for Lightning. I like Standard Notes, which is like a cross-device end-to-end encrypted note-taking app. But like these things are, you gotta try and limit the amount of apps you have on your phone. You gotta try and limit the usage. And like I always think of so Snowden has this post about what he does for his phone privacy, and he likes graphene. But what he does is he rips out the mic in the camera.
Yeah.
He uses a wired headset so that he can unplug the headset when he's not using it. And he doesn't use Wi-Fi. Instead, he uses Ethernet connected through the USB port on the phone, which is insane. Like, no one's going to do that. That's never going to happen. So you just try and find the right trade-off balance.
Yeah, that for most people is just not. It's not practical.
It's not practical at all. And if it's too overwhelming, people aren't going to do it. Right. That's the thing. Like, we need the ability for people to do actionable steps that aren't terribly inconvenient, that make mass surveillance more difficult. And a perfect example is Signal. Signal uses your phone number as your identifier, which that's not great. But everything's end-to-end encrypted. It's open source. It's pretty secure. It's a pretty secure platform. Would you be better off using PGP with no phone numbers attached from a straight security standpoint? Yes. But then all of a sudden, users have to be able to secure their keys and know all these different nuances to using it securely. With Signal, they can just install it, and it acts just like iMessage. It acts just like any other messenger app. So we're able to get millions of people to use Signal, while PGP has been around for way longer.
I was going to say,
arguably more secure, and no one fucking uses it.
Nobody uses PGP. Yeah, I mean it's not horrible to set up, but it takes time and it's more complicated than most people want to deal with. It's not a push button thing.
Yeah, and it has nuance. There's tons of nuance in the usage of it. So we just need these actionable things, and I think graphene is within reach of most people. I think trying to convince people not to use a smartphone is a lost endeavor in today's age. But if we can convince people to at least switch to a phone that respects their privacy, it's a huge step in the right direction.
Yeah. I think, and there's several, most of these, it's not obvious. So this is what I ran into when I installed graphene, and that there are the APKs available for Signal, for Telegram, for, I'm trying to think what else.
Samurai has a direct APK.
Yeah, yes.
Samurai has a direct APK.
But a lot of them are not obvious. Like Signals, I kind of had to do some digging. Actually, I just kind of tagged Signal and Telegram on Twitter and was just like, what's the deal, guys? And then someone responded back, and it was kind of egg on my face that they did have it out there, but
Signal makes it hard to find. It's pretty hard to find the Signal APK. So just to the listeners, an APK is just like an app file that allows you to install an app directly from the developer. And ideally, the developer has it signed with their PGP key, even though we just went into how no one uses PGP. If you do know how to use PGP, you can use their PGP key, their public key, to verify that the file hasn't changed from when they signed it. So you're improving your trust profile because you're only trusting the developer involved. You're not worried about a man in the middle switching out the file with a corrupted file. If you download from Google Play Store or you download from the Apple Store, even if it was an open source app to begin with, there's no way for you to verify that the app that got downloaded to your phone hasn't changed in the middle, in between that process. So yeah, ideally you want to download the APKs direct. Unfortunately, most of these developers don't provide that as an option. Ideally, if one is missing that you really want, you push the developer to start offering it, especially if it's something that's supposed to be privacy focused. But where we see a lot of issues are things like paid apps. They very rarely offer it. They like being tied into the subscription models of the different app stores, and the DRM, like the digital rights management, to make sure that people aren't sharing the app around. Like things like banking apps, like you're not gonna, and you probably shouldn't have a banking app installed on your phone. Yeah, that sucks. But maybe, you have an older phone that you just keep on Wi-Fi, that you have those certain apps that you consider you need, but you don't have to use them all the time It doesn't have to
Right.
be like one touch away.
Yeah. So that's a good transition for banking, because this is something that drives me crazy with a lot of banking apps is they will use SMS as two-factor authentication. And it drives me crazy because we've seen how many times that it's not secure, how easy it is to get SIM swapped, and they just don't care. Like, it's not a big deal to them.
Yeah, it's amazing because the banking sector is probably the worst offender of it still. Like, a lot of the other apps have switched, or at least give you the option of turning it off. With a lot of the banking apps, that's not the case. And part of the reason is because they use the phone number as a de facto identifier as well. Yeah. So, I mean, at the end, so a SIM swap is when a attacker is able to basically switch your phone number to their phone. Usually it's by social engineering. They contact the phone company. They say, I lost my phone. I need to activate a new phone. Sometimes it's an inside job. Like, if they know someone who works at T-Mobile or something, they can get them to do the SIM swap. And what people don't realize is it's two elements. So sometimes you have two-factor that's based through SMS. And if they SIM swap, then they get your two-factor code, that little code you put in when you try and sign into a service. But if it's only two-factor, then they also still need your, like your email address and your password or whatever.
Right.
But and a lot of services allow you to reset your password through SMS. And especially if your email provider allows it, then they can get into your email, and then a lot of services allow you to reset their passwords through an email to that compromised email address. So then once they get in, let's say you have your Gmail hooked up to a bunch of things. If they get into your Gmail, then they can then access everything else. So this is more of a security thing than a privacy thing, but it is tangential because your phone number is a privacy thing. And if your phone number is known, you're obviously more vulnerable to a SIM swap. This is, people who are in the Bitcoin world should be more cautious about it, because a lot of these exchanges and stuff are using, like if you're using Coinbase, we've seen people get their Coinbase accounts, emptied out. Obviously, if your keys are offline and they're not in a custodial exchange, which they shouldn't be in the first place, you shouldn't be susceptible to that. But they can cause all sorts of havoc if they're able to get your number for a little bit. Another one that people don't think about is Telegram. Telegram gives you the option of adding a password, but if you don't add a password, all you need to access a Telegram account is the phone number. So if you get SIM swapped and someone gets into your Telegram, they're going to see all the messages that you sent with people if you didn't delete any of them, since like forever. And the thing people don't think about is, let's say you're in a group with 6 people and you're having a conversation for the last 8 months, and one of them gets SIM swapped. That attacker has full access to what happened in that chat, right? For the last 6 months, 7 months, 8 months. So what can a user do? Everyone should try, first of all, try and lock everything down as much as possible. Specifically, if you have email addresses that log into really important accounts, try and lock down those emails as much as possible. And then after you do that, try and sign into your accounts with just your phone number. Click the I forgot my password button, click all through all the different prompts, try and get it reset, do all this stuff with just your phone number. Pretend you're the attacker and you have access to the phone number, and try and get it reset. That's really the only way to really insulate yourself from this type of thing is to constantly
red team yourself.
Yeah, and then also at the same time, you want to keep your phone number close to your chest. You don't want to be giving it out to a bunch of people. You don't want to post it on the internet. You want to be very careful with people having your phone number, which is a sad reality. Like, a phone number should be something that is a publicly distributed thing. It's a fucking phone number.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There you go. That might have been the first one.
Whatever. Nah, I don't know. Maybe.
There you go.
So, while we're on the 2FA thing, can we talk about the BlockFi thing that happened a week ago, 2 weeks ago?
Yeah. Of course we can.
I mean, it's just... Okay, so we kind of said that the bank, the legacy banking system continues to prefer to use this SMS as two-factor authentication, but the Bitcoin space should be better than this, I feel like. Maybe I'm just naive, but
what's interesting about BlockFi is I'm pretty sure they didn't allow customers to use SMS two-factor. They
just
forced
their employees.
So for the listeners, the best.
Yeah, well, let's give the story. Yeah,
the two best ways to use two-factor are either app-based, which is called OTP, where you have an app on your phone. Aegis Authenticator is an open source version, but they also have Google Authenticator if you want to go with the more normie route. But basically, based on time, it generates a new code for you offline on your device locally, and you enter that code. So that's pretty secure. For most people, that's the best trade-off balance. It's relatively convenient, and unless it's like a super fucking sophisticated actor, even if you're just using the Google Authenticator, you should be fine. And then the hardcore way is to get a hardware key that holds the information. YubiKey makes some. You can use like a Trezor to do it. And doing if you do use the Trezor, don't keep Bitcoin on the Trezor. Don't try and log into your
Trezor
email with with the wallet that has Bitcoin on it. But you can do it that way. But I think that's overkill for 99% of people. So with BlockFi, they didn't allow they were smart about that aspect. They didn't allow their customers to use. I'm pretty sure didn't allow their customers to use SMS two-factor. But one of the marketing guys was using SMS two-factor, and the attacker was able to get into the marketing guy's account. And from there, he wasn't able to access user funds, but he was able to access all the private information that the marketer was able to access, the salesperson was able to access. And there's two issues here. I mean, the first issue is, why does the salesperson have access to this intimate information to begin with?
They don't need that to do their job. Right. They shouldn't need that to do their job.
Account activity, withdrawal addresses, mailing address, full name, all this shit. And then the second thing is, the way I like to frame it is, we already know to Bitcoiners at least, I think it's a good framing. In the Bitcoin world, we know not your keys, not your coins. We know custodial wallets and exchanges are inherently risky, and that you can have an exit scam from them where they steal your Bitcoin or other things happen where it gets frozen or something like that. We should also consider custodial privacy, where they're custodying your private, intimate information. And we see this both in the Bitcoin world on these KYC services, KYC compliance services like BlockFi, and we see it in the normie world through Google and cell phone carriers and banks and all this stuff. It's all custodial privacy. And the problem is with a lot of these regulations, they can't delete that information. They have to hold on to it for years. So right now, let's say this whole thing with BlockFi left a bad taste in your mouth. Supposedly they've only compromised 50% of accounts. Let's say you're part of the 50% that wasn't compromised. Well, first of all, BlockFi didn't email them. They didn't post a blog. They didn't post on Twitter. They went radio silent. So if you're they only emailed the people that were affected. So if you're one of the 50%, you might have only found out because the block reported it, which, I've been critical of them many times, but at least they said it loud. Really loud. It was a really good article. Or you maybe heard about it on our show, or I was really outspoken about it on Twitter. It still pisses me off that the promoters of BlockFi weren't telling people about it. But anyway, you're one of the 50% of people that didn't get compromised. You want to delete your account. BlockFi can't delete that information.
Right.
Because of regulations. They have to hold on to that information. They could deactivate your account, but they will be a custodian of your privacy for the next decade or whatever. So you have to think in your head when you're sharing this information, when you're sharing all this private information with all these different companies, do you trust them? Do you trust them to safeguard it? Do you trust them not to have a marketer have it? Do you trust them not to have the marketer have SMS two-factor? All these little things and you want to minimize it as much as possible. So by all, like if we see this convenience privacy trade-off with KYC services. It's way easier to get Bitcoin if you comply with KYC, if you use a KYC compliance service.
Yeah.
But if you do, you should try and limit the amount of KYC services you use, right? Like, I think it's a lot more, and here we go back to the no phone versus graphene. I think telling people never buy through KYC is the majority of people are just going to ignore you. They're never going to do it. It's not attainable for them. But if you tell them, be careful who you give this information to. Limit the amount of people you give your KYC information to. Limit the amount of people that are custodians of your privacy. And try and pick actors that you think are the most trustworthy in the space. Then you could go a long way to minimizing that angle, that attack vector for you.
Right. I kind of addressed this. I wrote an article that I put in Hacker Noon about using BTC Pay Server and some other things back in January. And I kind of talked about this idea that like these companies who, I was talking more on the credit card fiat side of things, but, like Target or somebody like that is never meant to be, never set up like structurally to be a security focused guardian of all your private information, right? But like that's what they become when you're submitting all this information to them. And so the goes back to the so to give like the BlockFi thing, right? Only the 50%, and they didn't get funds, but they gave as far as we know, transaction withdrawal history. So they've got addresses. They've got physical addresses. If they got any of the KYC information, they might have like social security numbers or driver's license.
They didn't. They
pictures.
said phone number. Okay. They said pending withdrawal. This came after the fact. They said pending withdrawal addresses only, not deposit addresses. Total balance on BlockFi. Mailing address, which is a big one, where you live.
Yeah.
How much Bitcoin you own. And the withdrawal address is big too, because if you don't use CoinJoin or any other kind of techniques after the fact, then the attacker can use that to spy on you on chain to try and figure out your balances, past and future transactions and whatnot.
Well, and that specifically is relevant for BlockFi because they have a history of freezing accounts for users that were using CoinJoin.
Or at least specifically Wasabi users before they removed the fixed fee address.
Right.
So we're not, and they did publicly say that they're anti-CoinJoin. But it's one thing to say it versus actually following through with it. They did warn a bunch of users who were using Wasabi with the fixed address. This is why one of my issues with that fixed address, and I'm so glad they removed it, is because I think a lot of it is you need to give, I understand that these companies need to comply with regulations. I just wish they cared about privacy more and that they fought for user privacy more, which they're clearly not. A lot of these companies, BlockFi included, are not caring about privacy one bit. But some are. And the ones that are and aren't flagging CoinJoin, they aren't flagging CoinJoin, but they don't specifically say they're not flagging CoinJoin, is because you have to give them some plausible deniability. If it's in their face that this fixed fee address is, one hop away from a bunch of scam addresses and stuff, like it's going to pop up warnings all over the fucking place. And they can't turn a blind eye to it. But if it's, if it's a proper CoinJoin with no deterministic links and it's a couple hops back or something, like they can turn a blind eye to it and just be like, oh, we're complying, we're doing our best, there's no way for us to really tell.
Yeah.
So it's got to be a mix there, and there's some nuance there. So it's important that people realize that the good actors in the space can't, most of them have their hands tied and can't specifically say, that they'll turn a blind eye. But at the same time, we can't just rub it in their face and just, put them in that position where they have to make a decision.
Right.
And then the other thing I wanted to mention, first of all, your article was fantastic. So we should link to that in the show notes because I think it's very relevant here. I think people who hear me critical of all the data that Bitcoiners are leaking on a day-to-day basis and trying to educate people on using Bitcoin more privately and trying to support tools that help Bitcoiners more easily use Bitcoin more privately. They think that I'm saying that Bitcoin is failure as a result, but the alternative is horrible. Like,
Oh yeah.
what we already have is surveillance money. Like, unless you're using cash. Cash is extremely private. But the problem is that cash is being phased out, both at the government's level, where these governments are issuing more restrictions, but also at the user level. People don't want to use cash. Our peers, our age group, is quickly switching to Venmo and Cash App and credit card, everything. And all that data is being surveilled. When you go to Target, you're going through the security cameras. You know, you're signing up for the rewards card with your phone number. Then you're swiping your credit card. And all along that way, that data is being collected by like 15, 20 different companies, right?
Yeah.
And they're selling you targeted ads and selling you all this different shit. And if you order online, it's even worse. So that's the alternative. And especially as we see cash usage go down, it's going to get worse and worse. So I think there's an opening here with Bitcoin. I think it's an improvement. But I think people have to realize how much data they're leaking, because when you use the traditional system, you're pretty aware of it for the most part. I think most people know their credit card company's tracking them. They just don't give a shit. But with Bitcoin, people don't realize how much information they're actually leaking on a daily basis.
Okay, well, you say that. I think they know that their credit card company is tracking them, but I don't think a lot of people realize how many other companies there are in the mix. Like, they don't realize, they think, oh, my credit card company has all this information, but they've got it. I think the assumption is, well, my credit card company has it all anyways, just by nature of they have to see the transactions. I don't think they realize that
some random ad company in Singapore knows all their purchase history. Right,
exactly. You know, Target has it. They think, okay, Target has it, and whoever you want to pick, Visa, MasterCard has it. But they don't realize that there's like 12 other companies in between there that got sold that behavior and that data. And then that's all going to get aggregated and then used to serve you back. You know, at best, it's used to serve you back ads for, you know, quote unquote, your convenience. But, you know, we see more and more that those things are also used to, you know, like we said earlier, that's all collected. It's all stored up. And then later, you know, when you commit wrongthink online, then it's going to be used to target you and be evidence against you.
Or if you're like a protester, or one that gets a lot of people thinking is like religious texts, depending on where you live in the world. Sexual orientation, depending on where you live in the world. All these things can be deducted based on payment records. Your payments give up a lot of information about you, especially at scale when it's all aggregated. It's quite alarming. And I don't think people realize the profiles that are being built on people. And they're stored insecurely, in perpetuity, and used against you at will. And you don't know. You don't realize what's going on. And that needs to change. And the way we change that, just to go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, is not through petitions. It's not through politics. It's through tools that are open source, through networks like Bitcoin, that empower individuals to take back some of this, take back some of this power and make it more difficult for like a few people to just have mass surveillance capabilities.
Yeah. Real quick, can we kind of touch on like just computers? Because I know that there's a lot there to get, and I know that the short version is that, you know, Mac is closed source, so we can't trust that, and Windows is a giant cluster, you know. But
this is what's frustrating me the most about the Snowden stuff, and this is what I wish our politicians realized, is if we didn't have to worry about our own government spying on us, your threat model is greatly reduced.
For sure.
It'd be way easier for people to maintain privacy. First of all, no one should be using Windows. It's just a complete mess. So you shouldn't be using Windows. Ideally, you should be using Linux. A nice balance in the middle is a Mac, right? It is close to it, but see, this is the thing. It's like if you're not if you don't care about the NSA, if the NSA isn't spying on you, or if you just decide that the NSA is not part of your threat model, you're fine with the U.S. government spying on you, then a Mac is a decent option, is a pretty good option. A Chromebook is a great option in that scenario because it's encrypted by default. It's like completely locked down, single purpose machine that actually has like a pretty good security trade-off there. If you don't care about the U.S. government and Google being complicit with the U.S. government, right? But when you add all these other things into the mix, all of a sudden, to try and improve your privacy a little bit, you might be compromising in other ways. Like the nice thing about let's go into Chromebooks for instance.
Okay.
If you're
because this is not something I'm familiar with.
Right. So when the Olympics were in Russia, right? And you're traveling, whenever you travel across borders, you're way more susceptible to physical attacks where they have your hardware in their hand and they're able to compromise it somehow, right? So you're traveling across the Russian border and all of these big news anchors and stuff that make $7-8 million a year and are prime targets for Russian espionage are traveling across this border with physical hardware. A good rule of thumb for them was they would travel with an empty Chromebook that is encrypted by default. So with physical access, it's encrypted by default. If it's tampered with, it automatically, Google has these protections in place that is like checking on boot and whatnot. And you sign into your Google account once you cross the border, and then you have access to all your information. So if something happens to the Chromebook in between, you should be good. But it doesn't protect you from the U.S. government, right? It doesn't protect you from Google. And if Google's complicit with the U.S. government, then it definitely doesn't protect you. But for that one threat model, it could be the ideal way of traveling across the border for that person. So it is really frustrating in that regard. Like, I really wish our government was trying to protect our privacy rather than like actively fight against that. It's a balancing act, and so but if you don't know what you're doing and you're running a Linux laptop and someone gets physical access to that device, you could be way less secure than if you were running a MacBook or a Chromebook.
Yeah. Because
you might be more secure from remote attacks from, like a government entity or a major corporation. But when it comes to a physical attack, you're way less secure. Or like something like an iPhone, right? Like a latest gen iPhone, you might be more secure. You might be more secure in a physical attack type of situation if it's not the U.S. government, if it's not, if it's not a super sophisticated actor, if it's like the Belarusian government and they want to access your phone, like for the average user, their most secure phone for them could be the latest generation iPhone, but you're giving up your privacy to these other. So it's important for people to realize, what is my threat model? Who am I trying to protect myself against? And then you have to basically go according to that, because there's no one size fits all. What I try and do is I try and distill, not necessarily a one size fits all, but a general trade-off balance that I think fits a lot of people, and then give a massive disclaimer that it might, your mileage may vary. It might not help everyone. And with phones, I say graphene. And then with physical computers, basically just anything that's really important should never touch an internet connected device. It should just never touch an internet connected device. It should be in a notepad. It should be on pieces of paper, and you just never touch it, and you don't have to worry about it being compromised or anything like that. And then furthermore, operate under the assumption that if anyone gets physical access to these devices, they're going to get in. And if you go from that point, then at least you won't be caught off guard.
Right. So then maybe if you're traveling internationally, because when you travel internationally, I think for a lot of people, your threat model does change, right? And so while it irritates me, frustrates me to no end that our government is spying on us, at the same time, if I go to some other country, I want that protection of being a U.S. citizen most of the time, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe it's a good idea if you think you're going to be spending some time internationally. Now it's probably not an applicable time, right? Here we are. If you're listening to this in the future, we're at the end of May 2020. Most of the lockdowns have kind of started opening up somewhat, but it's still things are still restricted. Really, international travel is not happening. So, but in the future, hopefully, if things get back to some sort of normalcy, then maybe getting a different phone when you travel.
Yeah.
Then
absolutely.
use a graphene phone where you live and work normally as your daily driver, and then get the new generation whatever.
Or not even that. What like when I travel, when the U.S. government, when you travel, it's obviously you have to deal with other governments when you travel, but the U.S. government, you have no rights when you're crossing that border. You have no rights, and they can search all of your shit. And especially as an outspoken Bitcoiner who cares about privacy, I consider myself a bigger target. Maybe that's just paranoia and a little bit of ego, like stay humble, Matt. But it's also me trying to stay humble and be like, okay, I'm not above that. I got to be careful. So I actually will not travel with any of my, I won't travel with any of my like real electronics. Like sometimes I'll bring like a pared down Chromebook with me. Sometimes I'll bring no computer. Sometimes I have a Linux laptop that I bring a lot of times that I don't use it for anything important. It's just constantly always wiped. Phones, like you have a specific travel burner phone that doesn't have all your bank apps and all these different all your communication apps. It shouldn't be like logged into Signal. It shouldn't be logged into Telegram, all this stuff, because then you're not necessarily talking about physical security. Like they could lock you in a room and compel you to give them your password. We saw this happen with Glenn Greenwald, his partner, like his lover, with encrypted Snowden docs, where they like the British kept him in a locked room for like 15 hours, 18 hours, trying to get him to give him the password to decrypt the device. So you gotta be extra careful when you're crossing borders. And try and limit the amount of information that you do carry when you do cross the borders. And also on top of that, like you shouldn't be telling people, like you shouldn't broadcast on social media that you're traveling and what flight you're traveling on and where you're going, because people don't realize there's degrees to all these different privacy things, right? And just because, okay, you bought the plane ticket using your Visa card and you had to put in your passport number, maybe the U.S. government knows you're traveling, right? But you don't have to tell every other person in the world that you're traveling, on what flight you're traveling, and what airport you're traveling, how long you're going to be away from your home that might have other important shit back at home, right? And you got to keep in mind what's at home. Can that get physically compromised while I'm gone? Do I have to deal with all this shit? So it's all got to be constantly going through your head.
Yeah, that was actually something so funny enough. Even like when Facebook first kind of came out, that was something my dad was always really good about, like, making sure that we were aware of, was like, don't broadcast that stuff online because you don't have control over people who read that stuff. And even not just like someone taking it for like wherever you're going, but like, hey, now everyone knows that your house is empty.
Exactly. Home break-in. Perfect timing.
Yeah. You just want to be careful on that end as well. But also, obviously, this is kind of goes back to the point you've made before too. Like if you're going to, really anywhere, like you don't want to, like if you're traveling or whatever, be broadcasting that you're a Bitcoiner or that you have a bunch of, wealth or whatever.
The thing about the Bitcoin thing, I mean, and people call me a hypocrite, by the way, all the time. that I'm not allowed to talk about privacy because I'm a public figure. So I'm a hypocrite because I've ruined my privacy in that regard, and I completely understand that perspective. People shouldn't telegraph their Bitcoin ownership. It doesn't make you a bigger target right now, especially if you're traveling. Even if your government is pro Bitcoin and isn't doing anything, things like I won't travel to China, for instance, because that information's out there. And I respect the use of NIMS. Like, I think people should use NIMS when they're interacting in online Bitcoin communities and try and not connect that to themselves. I've used many NIMS through the years until I became more public. But at the same time, I do think we need public people advocating for this stuff. We can't just have like the Pomps of the world being the public people.
Right.
Then we're kind of screwed. So like everyone has their role. And then the other thing I think is, if we're right about Bitcoin in the next 5 years, 10 years, Bitcoin is going to become so ubiquitous that this increased, kidnapping, extortion, theft risk that Bitcoiners face right now, will just apply to all rich people. Like if you kidnap a rich person's daughter, you will just assume as the kidnapper that they can access $5 million worth of Bitcoin within a couple days. The ransom demands in Bitcoin. It doesn't matter that they're a Bitcoiner or not. They should be able to get the Bitcoin to pay you, even if they don't have it. Right. So I think that does normalize out over time. We just aren't there yet.
Well, you see that happening, I guess, now, even with like ransomware and things like that.
Exactly.
It's like, that the hospitals or the schools or whoever they're sending that virus to, as a Bitcoiner, you look at it and you're like, there's no way that school has reserves sitting around in Bitcoin.
Right. But they can go get Bitcoin. If they need to get Bitcoin, they can get Bitcoin. And that's going to become even more so over the next couple of years as like Bitcoin access becomes bigger and bigger. Yeah.
So we've talked about phone, we've talked about computer. Let's talk about like physical on your person. I know we kind of going to have to go through this one fast. And you've mentioned these things. The mask thing drives me crazy. I don't know. Masks have become so like bizarrely politicized right now.
Isn't it weird?
It's so weird because it's like, in the beginning, January or whatever, the WHO was in the CDC were saying, masks don't help, blah, blah, blah. And you can take it. I had, as someone who works in the medical field, I've had conversations with medical people. If you give them the biggest benefit of the doubt, the point was most people don't use masks correctly the masks don't work in the way that you think they work for preventing you from catching someone else's sickness. But
they were full of shit. They were caught with, I think that this idea that, and I already see them revising history. They're saying that,
for sure.
They're saying that they just wanted to reserve the medical masks for the medical professionals, all this stuff. They never
should have said that.
Yeah, they said masks don't work and you shouldn't wear a mask, but at the same time they said you should stay 6 feet apart. And masks do the same thing as staying 6 feet apart. It's the same idea, trying to reduce that aerosol transmission, the air transmission. I think that it's not a coincidence that out of all the things that they were pushing for, the one thing that actually helped your privacy instead of hurt it was the one that they didn't want us to do, which was wear a mask. And we see that right now in Minneapolis and all these places where the protests are happening. These protests,
they're not wearing masks.
No, but some of them are. Like, there's a lot that are wearing masks, and it's normalized, right? Like they can fit into the crowd better because they are wearing a mask. It reduces the ability for governments to enforce all these different surveillance measures if a bunch of the populace is running around with masks. Like right now they're accusing, like on Twitter, they're accusing this police officer of instigating a bunch of. And did you see what he was wearing? He was wearing one of the big masks, with the two respirators on, with the two filters on the side, a nice big one. And like if you walk down a street with that 2 months ago, 3 months ago, you would stand out like a sore thumb, right? But right now, in the current situation, even if not everyone's wearing masks, just the fact of seeing someone wearing that isn't necessarily a standout thing, right? So it does reduce their ability to police and do all this other stuff. The weird thing for me was the swap where the same people that were wearing masks when they told us that we shouldn't wear masks are they're anti-mask. It's active defiance not to wear a mask. And to me, that'd be the equivalent of the government saying that we all have to use end-to-end encryption. And as an act of defiance, I just sent plain text messages with no encryption whatsoever. It's just backwards to me, and it makes no sense. But at the same time, I do respect. Government shouldn't force people to wear masks. Of course, we went from no masks to forced masks. Like, that's just classic.
But this is like where people and I don't remember if it was on the Bottomshelf account or on my personal account that I tweeted out. To the idea that like. People setting your ideas and your principles and stuff based on just doing it on the opposite of what your enemy does is idiotic, right? Because a broken clock is right twice a day. People, get into my gun politics here. David Hogg, I have huge disagreements with basically 99% of things that David Hogg says, but once in a while he'll say something about that Broward County sheriff that got rehired after sitting outside of their school while kids were getting shot. Should have never been rehired. I agree 100% with that. So if I set my moral compass based on him because I disagree with him 99% of the time, I would have disagreed with him on that. And that's idiotic. Right? So like I saw people that were getting mad when Trump was talking about how bad FISA is, and it's like, oh well, the logical, in their mind, the logical thing is, oh, he's got a bunch of skeletons in his closet. This proves, and it's like, you idiot! Like, it's okay that he can be right that we shouldn't have secret courts and like warrantless spying on American citizens. Yeah,
we'll take what we can get, right? Like, agree with focus on ideas, not like people and teams and all this shit.
Yeah. Like look at Hong Kong, right? What are those protesters wearing?
Yeah, that's what I said this on the podcast. I was like, if you told a Hong Konger that not wearing a mask was an act of defiance, they would laugh you out of the fucking room.
Exactly.
They cherish their masks. They understand that it's a tool for them to fight back.
So the other thing, I think you and Marty have talked about this, but like facial recognition, they do have facial recognition that goes beyond people just wearing masks, especially just like procedural masks. So, like the eyes and the bridge.
They don't have facial recognition that can get the hat with glasses and mask on. And it's the same thing again, where we go back. It's like, can they own specific people? Sure. Will they probably have like gait and detection and stuff where they can tell how you walk and all these different things. Right. Like, probably. But they're going to go after the lowest hanging fruit and they're going to mass surveil that shit. So, before they even use face recognition, they're probably going to use the tracker that you have in your pocket, which is your phone. Right.
Yep.
And then they're going to do basic facial recognition and they're going to hoover up the overwhelming majority of anyone else that's left there. And then maybe they'll be able to do facial recognition with the mask on, no glasses and stuff. It's like all different steps, right? And you just try and make it a little bit more difficult for them.
Right. They're going to go after the easiest things first. They're just like the common thief is going to go for, the house with no fence versus the house with a fence. Like, they're going to go after what's easiest for them to get first. And
there's another good comparison. That is these license plate readers where they're able to track all these cars that move all around the place. In New York, we have something called the Easy Pass, one of those RFID things that you stick on your windshield that you pay your tolls with. They're like all over the country by different names.
Right.
They are definitely tracking by license plate, but the cheaper and way more effective thing for them to be doing, which they are doing, is they have Easy Pass readers located all throughout the city. So if you just leave the Easy Pass up on your window, they're just pinging that all day long. And what do they say? They say it's anonymized data for traffic congestion. but it's all these different little things, and you
So
can
it's
make
just
slight
readers that are up
improvements.
that aren't. Sorry. So it's just readers that are up that are not. They're not told.
They're not tolls.
Charging you. They're just tracking you.
They're just reading, okay, this is account holder, blah, blah, and they moved past at this time, and they moved past the last reader, 20 minutes ago, and they can draw maps and pictures with all that stuff.
Don't y'all have? Well, maybe not in the city. I ran across this one time when I was in New York with somebody, and they were saying they had certain like bridges and things, and if you hit the, they check you when you get onto the bridge, and they check you the time when you cross over the end of the bridge, and they would send you a ticket for if you went over too fast. No, we don't have that in
New York yet.
Oh, okay.
I did see that in England when I was in England, but I actually kind of like from a surveillance point of view, like they can go fuck themselves. But apologies, but from just like a person point of view, like I much prefer that over a cop pulling me over and potentially trumping up the charges and making a whole thing about it, right? Like in that regard, I just consider it, they have to make revenue, and it's like I'm paying the speeding upgrade. It's like if I want to get somewhere faster, then I have to pay the bonus price to increase.
It's not like a convenience charge.
Yeah, but fortunately, a lot of places in America are pushing back on it from a constitutional point of view, because it's really hard to fight those tickets. The other thing is, like, we have red light cameras everywhere, which I think are worse, because the red light cameras, they're taking pictures and they know who's in the car and stuff like that.
Right.
They're reading the license plate, so they know the car holder, they know who owns the car, and then they're taking a picture of the person. The license plate readers is really bad. People don't realize how much data they're pulling from that. And they kind of have like an end around where it's not considered like data, like surveillance, where they need warrants and stuff. They can just... And they have like, I think in Texas, they have like private companies that are doing it. So the like private company has like massive databases on all the license plates and where they've been and stuff.
We actually got, in my city, we got it voted out because they had those traffic light cameras, and everybody was getting hit with them because they were super sensitive. It's like if you pull up to the stop sign and you just like roll your car 2 inches forward past the magic line, they'd send you a ticket. And there was they were sending them to some private company outside of Texas. Yeah, and so they so basically because there was no due process, no actual way to because it was basically done by a machine, and there was no way to what's the word I'm looking for, like face your accuser or whatever. They voted him out and got him out of our city. But yeah, it was pretty bad.
Yeah, it's and like people need to realize, like, even if you agree with like the people in charge right now, with the politicians in charge right now, like things can turn super quick, and you just think about like who do you want to have that data? Who do you trust with that data? And that data can get leaked, to get hacked. We see U.S. government databases get hacked by China all the time. They hacked the personnel databases of like the Department of Homeland Security or someone, one of the big federal agencies, of their own personnel, right? And if they can't keep their own personnel's data safe, let alone all of our data, who we're not even their people, and just ask yourself, like, do you want a dictator in China to have this intimate data? Do you want a dictator in your home to have this data? Do you want, who can have that data? And you got to really... Everyone's going to get that data if you don't clamp it down. Right. You got to start clamping it down and caring about it. That's the first step, is caring about it. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So, we'll kind of wrap it up here, but, consider what data you're sending out. Figure out what your threat model is. Get a phone that's more secure. Consider changing or limiting what apps you put on there, what services you're subscribed to. Wear a mask, not for, regardless of the health benefits or not. Wearing a mask helps protect against mass surveillance. Every little step that makes you a harder fish to fry than puts you at an advantage when they're just sweeping for low-hanging fruit.
Uninstall TikTok.
Yeah. As a self-respecting grown adult, you should not be using TikTok. That's my opinion. Don't do it. But yeah, isn't that like a Chinese company too?
Yeah, they're a Chinese company. I feel like I always end up talking past people, right? Because like I talk to people about privacy and they have Snapchat on their phone, they have TikTok on their phone, but all these different little things, just try and limit it. Every little step counts, and just be aware.
Yep. All right, man. Anything else to say?
Nope. I had a great time as usual, and hopefully I'll see you in person soon.
Likewise. All right. Take care.
Peace.
All right, that's going to be it for the interview this week. I'm recording this bumper on Monday evening, right after Trump just gave his address listing Antifa as a terrorist group and saying that he would be deploying the military if cities can't contain their violence. Just to be clear, by declaring Antifa as a terrorist organization, that puts them subject to the 2012 NDAA, meaning if you are declared as Antifa, your assets can be frozen and you can be indefinitely detained without due processes and other rights due as an American citizen. So Antifa is terrible. They're violent criminals with a history of being violent over and over again. But the unintended consequences of this could be really, really bad. Basically, if you speak out against the government, I would hope this wouldn't happen, but there's really nothing stopping this from happening, that if you are declared Antifa, then those things could happen to you, even if you're not Antifa. If you have a history of speaking out politically against the state, and you don't have an on account, might be a good time to think about creating one for voicing your political dissent here forward. I don't know. Something I'm going to have to think about. And then the other thing to note, speaking of unintended consequences or intended consequences, but not publicly stated consequences, is that we've already seen, so like I said, it's Monday night here, and I'm about to drop this episode, and we recorded this interview on Friday, and even in between that short time, it's like, feels like half the country's on fire for the U.S. Sorry for my international listeners. I don't mean to exclude you. These privacy things definitely include you and this next part for sure. But we've already seen them start using contact tracing apps to locate and track protesters. So, no big deal. Just everything we said they would do with the contact tracing apps is now coming to fruition. It's not just for tracing the virus. They're going to trace whatever group they don't like. So don't install the apps. Hopefully, if you're on iOS, you have not updated to the newest version and you don't have automatic updates on. Yeah. Just to be clear, violent police and violent rioters are both bad. I shouldn't have to say that. It should be obvious because I'm a sane person and hopefully you are too. But I don't know. I feel like apparently you have to state that. Yeah. So be careful. Protect yourself and your neighbors and your family. Work to create a parallel world that is hard for them to grab you through. Using cryptographically secured communications and cryptographic money. Alright. Sorry this is kind of a heavy week. It's just the world's kind of gone nuts. And I try and be an optimistic, hopeful person. So let's keep working to build good things that they can't tear down. And in that line, I will be speaking next week with Brian Harrington talking about spending Bitcoin, the hodl versus spending, kind of thing that's been going around on Twitter, and establishing a circular economy. I'm excited for that. I think it's going to be a good chat. For Bottomshelf Bitcoin, I'm Josh Humphrey. Stay safe. Godspeed.